Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us at this Ask the Author session co-hosted by Table and the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. I'm Matthew Kessler, a Research and Communications Officer at Table, and I'll be introducing and moderating the session today. I'll keep this intro very brief so we can have more time for the discussion. We're here to discuss a chapter from the recently published book, True Cost Accounting for Food, Balancing the Scales, that demonstrates how true cost accounting can be used as an effective tool to shift how we think about food system transformation. And today we'll be focusing on the first chapter, written by Nadia El-Haji Shalaba and Carl Obst, From Practice to Policy, New Metrics for the 21st Century. The agenda for today is fairly straightforward. After some short housekeeping, I'll hand the screen over to Lauren Baker, one of the book's 3 co-editors, to introduce the book in more depth, and then over to Carl Obst to introduce some key findings from the chapter. We'll then open the floor for panelists to start the discussion using the chapter as a starting point, and then we'll dig into the values, opportunities, and limitations of true cost accounting through this Ask the Author format. We'll end with some concluding remarks from Lauren and Carl, and then keep the room open for an additional 15 minutes for a more informal discussion. Some quick housekeeping. Please be aware that we're recording this session and we may share it later on our website. We've invited people and others have volunteered to engage in this session as panelists, and can someone, can Stephen, thank you, and maybe Agnes, perfect. And so, yeah, we've invited people who are joining us from around the world and approach this topic from different backgrounds and perspectives. So for the panelists, if you'd like to speak, please raise your virtual or physical hand. And besides asking questions, you're also very welcome to respond to what others previously said. But please be aware that our time here is short and we'd like to include as many voices as possible. Lastly, I just want to highlight that the Zoom Q&A section is open for questions and comments. And please use the Q&A and not the chat. We encourage everyone to use it to both ask questions and also to respond to them. And now over to Lauren Baker, Director of Programs at the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, whose work focuses on the intersection between food systems and health, climate change, agroecology, and true cost accounting, to introduce the book. Over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Matthew, and really great to be here. This is such a wonderful opportunity to introduce this book to all of you. So thanks for joining, and thanks so much to Tables for making this possible. This book is the result of a wonderfully collaborative process. In 2017, the Global Alliance for the Future of Food convened a community of practice on true cost accounting. This came on the heels of the development of the TEEB Agri-Food Food Systems Evaluation Framework that was developed by UN Environment and involved many of the same people. And this community of practice has been meeting regularly ever since. And the book is a key project that was identified really immediately by that community of colleagues. And so, today it's really fantastic to expand the conversation. And I just wanted to say, of course, anyone interested can be in touch about the community of practice and the activities. So what is true cost accounting? True cost accounting is an evolving, holistic, and systemic approach to assess, measure, and value externalities, both positive and negative externalities, environmental, social, health, and economic costs and benefits. And really the purpose of true cost accounting is to support decision-making of people across the food system. In our introduction, Barbara Gemmell-Heron and Paula Daniels, co-editors with me, we write what sounds on the surface like a complicated tool relegated to accountants is ultimately a clarion call for a new economics of food and a new relationship with the land and the food that we eat, starting with a holistic view of a system out of balance and ending with a new approach to business and integrated reporting. So before I hand it over to Carl to launch our discussion, I wanted to just lift up a few themes from the book that I think are important. First is the kind of broad attempt and by the contributors to holistically frame the work that they're doing on food systems using measurement and metrics as one tool, but just systems thinking in general. The contributors really illustrate the importance of engagement across the food system and food value chain, looking at the externalities of farming, both positive and negative. So positive benefits of farming systems when they're managed well, and the negative impacts of farming, as well as human health impacts and consumer concerns across the food system. So they're really interesting examples from multiple entry points. Also, the interdependence of the different components of what in reality is an integrated whole. So I really wanted to stress this, and hopefully Carl will lift this up as well, that we're not just looking at these as separate parts, but really the interdependence across the system. The authors, I think, really illustrate the importance of staying attuned to unintended or unattended to consequences across the system. So we're really trying to avoid unintended consequences of decisions. And then finally, there are a whole set of, I think, really important themes in the book that will hopefully inform our discussion today. One is the issue of power and structural inequities and inequalities across the food system. Another is the importance of governance. When we think of food as a public good, that requires a really high level of governance and a deep level of governance. And so there are many illustrations of that in the book. Also, another theme is the way that true cost accounting can help us de-risk the future. And then finally, there's an important theme in the book around true cost accounting as a transparent and participatory process that engages decision makers and people across the food system as central actors and agents of change. So at the meta level, true cost accounting provides an actionable frameworks based on systems thinking and complexity science, really exploring the big picture, understanding the dynamics of the system, acknowledging the role of people in these complex dynamic systems. And with that, I'll end just by expressing deep appreciation to everyone who contributed to the book. Several contributors are with us today. They had really incredible insights to share, and I'm very much looking forward to this discussion with all of you and with Carl. Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, Lauren. That was a great summary. And now over to Carl Obst, an expert at applying natural capital accounting at IDEEA Group, the Institute for Development of Environmental Economic Accounting. Over to you, Carl.
Great. I'm just going to share my screen here. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Matthew, and thanks to Lauren. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to be able to talk with you all. Is our small contribution, and I say our. I've done this chapter together with Nadia El-Haj-Gialaba from the FAO, and it's one part. I hope it should be clear that this chapter is one part of a much larger volume of work, and there's so many different angles which have been brought together as Lauren has sort of outlined. So the particular focus that we wanted to, so I'll just give a quick introduction to chapter 1 here, touch on a few themes that came through in that chapter, but obviously in the course of the discussion, quite a range of other things might come through. So the challenge that we were trying to deal with was the one that was, I think, outlined fairly clearly in a paper by Pavan Sukhdev and others in Nature. The paper was titled Fix Food Metrics, and it's quite a direct observation by Pavan and his colleagues. Food metrics must be urgently overhauled, or the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals will never be achieved. So it says something to the importance of food in the overall concept of sustainability, but it says that the angle that we were taking on this chapter was really about food metrics. And so a lot of the work around the tea agri-food process, which Lauren mentioned before, was focused on this question of how to do these evaluations in a more robust and broadly understood way. So the reality is that in the food metrics business and in the space of sustainability, there are many, and I've noted here perhaps too many responses to this challenge. And the goal, in a sense, is to identify the fact that there's this sort of standard approach to assessing success in food production, which focuses on yield per hectare. And everyone, well, the many people, certainly I'm going to presume that most of the people on this call are accepting that yield per hectare is a significantly insufficient measure. But we don't seem to be able to break through that challenge. So the reality also seems to be it's not a lack of solutions. We know a lot about what to do. We know a lot about how to measure things. So the thesis of the chapter is really about the idea that we need to to respond to the food metrics. We need a greater degree of comparability to be able to allow farmers, investors, consumers, policymakers to be able to compare different situations across different farming contexts. And accepting that there are these different contexts, how do we get to that richness of a measure? So that's the starting point. What we outline in the chapter is that there are some probably very significant benefits that would come from having widely applied, standardized, independent assessment metrics covering all of these different dimensions, the economic, environmental, and social dimensions. So to pick up on Lauren's point, it's not just seeing that we have economic, environmental, and social as three different themes that need to be considered, but we consider those themes together in an integrated and spatially specific context. So these benefits would be things along the lines of, include, because I wouldn't think this was an exhaustive list, that we would be able to look at things at a local level and compare alternative farming practices and how they worked, to get messages to consumers, messages to the finance sector about comparing different investments in different places. For me, one of the strongest things will be this notion of a common language. I think many aspects of sustainability, not just around food systems, have struggled with the idea that that there are multiple different terms and languages and definitions for basically a very similar and core idea that many groups have formed over time. And if we can find a way to get those groups to work together so that when they use the word impact or they use the word accounting, it's being used in the same way, then the capacity to exchange experiences, exchange data, build on each other's knowledge and perspectives will be much greater. And I think in actual fact, the book as a whole is an excellent demonstration of what is actually possible when you start bringing people together into these communities of practice. Another part of it is this final quote that comes out of our chapter, fundamentally a focus on alternative solutions without allowing individual stakeholders to reach their own conclusions cannot drive change. So we're really trying to say that metrics, being able to make those local stakeholder is particularly important. So the rest of the book, the chapter, works through how you might think about developing these standards. And it would be simple to say that there should just be one true cost accounting standard, for example. But the reality is there are many components to that process of standardization. We identified 5, the idea that we might want to come up with some standardized, more standardized conceptual frameworks, some standardized metrics and targets for thinking about sustainability of systems, the need to standardize the data, that both at a micro level and the need to think carefully about valuation approaches and think about perspectives that come in the question of valuation, not just monetary, but commonly monetary. And then to think about standards around reporting and disclosure. We saw 3 main ways of moving forward. There was a particular role of government leadership. At the end of the day, standards don't need to be perfect, but they need to be authoritative. So without that level, they don't get the credence that they might otherwise get. And that's particularly the case with measures that are well known to most people around gross domestic product, for example, GDP. It's not a perfect measure before, but it's certainly accepted and has that authority. So how do we reach that level is really the question that we were trying to tackle. it's in that sense, it's about doing things in a stepwise process. Don't think about trying to solve everything, get a grand unifying single standard across all of these different aspects at once, but actually try and work on them collectively. There's different stakeholders, different experts that are involved in each of these different areas of standardization. So we need to and do what seems sensible and in that sort of stepwise manner. And really, it's starting now. The technical knowledge is not the barrier. We have the data. We can find it. We know how to measure things if we don't have the data. We have the solutions. We know what the sustainability choices are in order to take things forward. And we know that all of those things will get better over time. So the question is, how do we make the institutional and interdisciplinary coordination, how do we get that happening to really take this work forward? So I think that'll do for me. Looking forward to the discussion, and hopefully that's a good starting point. Thanks.
Thanks, Carl. All right, so now we will open the floor to questions and discussion. So if any of the panelists would like to raise your hand, and I can call on you, and as well attendees can certainly fill in questions in the Q&A section in the chat as well. And perhaps while we're waiting for someone to first raise their hand, all right, we have a question from Willie. The floor is over to you. If you could first introduce yourself very briefly and then proceed with your question or comment. Thanks. And if you can unmute as well first.
Sorry for that. My name is Willie Boltz. I'm working at Wageningen Economic Research in the Netherlands. And let's say 80% of my work is dedicated to what we call true pricing or true cost accounting. So I'm very involved in this world. The question I have is that I think that one issue to get forward is that we have to decide upon what items, what issues, or what themes are we seeing as externalities. I never found a list in the literature of the themes that we should take into account, and I see a lot of different lists. But I also in this chapter I didn't find a criteria how to select them, and I think more globally we know what to take into account, but to become a decent method, I think we should decide upon what should we take in it or leave it out. Thank you.
Thanks. Would any of the panelists, Carl or Lauren, like to respond to that?
Yeah, maybe I should have the first go. Thanks for the question, Willie. My initial reaction, we did present a table in the chapter which suggested some metrics and of things that you would want to understand in terms of changes in the context across economic, environmental, and social conditions, which would be in any particular system context at a farm level or across the supply chain. Now, I guess it then gets to the question that how do you think about well, the framing that I would come from is that understanding how the stocks and flows within those systems are changing is what's necessary in the first instance, and from that you would then determine what were the material externalities in any given context. I don't think there's going to be the same set of externalities in every different place. So what we would be sort of looking for in this sort of sense is then how do you then have a more complete documentation, as it were, of changes in the different capitals, the produced natural, human and social capitals, how they're changing, how the incomes and the health and the environmental ecosystem services are changing, monitoring those out, and then you're able to tell a story about the externalities. It's, I think, starting from the externalities lens rather than starting from a capitals lens can sort of lead you to become perhaps a slightly narrower in your focus about the system itself. So I think it's sort of really about the entry point that you come from. So, and in that sense, the scope, I think, is relatively clear, that you want to start broad and then make it context specific.
Thanks, Carl. And I see Fitri, you have a hand up. If you could introduce yourself and then ask your question or comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. My name is Fitri Abdiansyah. I'm the global leader for nature-based solution for IDEEA Sustainable Trade Initiative, but also directing IDEEA operation in Indonesia and Malaysia. Thank you so much, Carl, for a very important chapter that you wrote with Nadia. I'm just wondering, based on our experience, usually there's a tendency of having different perceptions between the upstream players compared to the downstream players, including also those consumer good forum companies or global brands, when it comes to viewing the indicators or the importance of elements to measure. Just to give you an example, let's say producer or growers, they would like to address impacts that are felt in the surrounding areas, be it environment, social, or what have you. But of course, the global brands or the consumers, they would like to address issues related to most likely global issues or the consumer countries type of challenges like climate change and what have you. In your view, and also based on your research, what would be the the middle ground usually when it comes to this matrix of indicators, and how can we set priority? Which one should be the one, for instance, that we can push in terms of the agenda? Seeing this as important elements to have a good true accounting cost. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that one, it's a great question. Again, again, this issue of trying to be able to establish upfront what things should be measured, it's not an easy answer to take, but I think as an actual fact, sort of, it feels like the wrong way into the question. I think for me, I would be starting local. I'd be starting local and understanding that context. I'd probably be thinking in a landscape type of scale and trying to understand how it is that the community, the farmers, the environment in that area are being affected by or contributing positively to those various social outcomes, environmental outcomes, economic outcomes at that scale. For me, then it's a question, if someone's coming in from the outside, as it were, trying to get some sort of, with their own sort of thoughts about it, because they've got a standard which is being, or a question or a challenge that they see from that other perspective, I think that sort of should then start to complement it. But I think you really need, for the focus in the sort of food systems in this context is actually understanding what's happening at a local scale. So I'd be really giving a priority in that space and thinking about the capitals in those spaces and how those are changing, and then trying to be able to convey that story up the line. I guess that will be my initial response. But it is certainly a difficult challenge, especially if there's standards and reporting disclosure standards which are coming in from outside.
Lauren, did you want to jump in there with an additional comment?
Sure. Just one comment that I think links the two questions. So the process of bringing people together, so whether that's at a local level or actually across a value chain, a complex value chain where you're bringing farmers and traders and processors together, is I think really important in this work. So the process yields important insights, and so I think there's a balance between, as Carl said, maybe it's the wrong way to enter the question in terms of what are we measuring, but a complementary question could be, what is the process that will yield the important insights that we need to address the sort of systemic shifts that we have to make to improve, to catalyze improvements across the system. So I think in the book, multiple chapters illustrate the importance of the process and the kind of dialogue around that in terms of yielding the insights the interesting insights that can come from that.
Thanks. And Stephen, you had your hand up, and then followed by that, Francisca.
Hi, Stephen Lord from the University of Oxford. I run the Food System Impact Valuation Initiative in the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford. So just following on, I think, from Willie's question, and I think Fitrian's comment as well, Carl talked about a capital lens, but I think there is also a valid view to look at it from a user lens, in the sense of the externality that matters depends upon the user. You know, who wants the accounting and what do they want to do the accounting for? And when you have the user lens, whether they're an insurer, a financer, a taxer, or a procurer, or a grower looking to, you know, to demonstrate their sustainability credentials, etc., that, you know, then we get into this, the difficulty or the trade-off of trying to standardize. If you're trying to standardize across many different locations, which is quite hard to do from a data point of view, and then you have different users who actually, you know, care about different parts of the externalities, then it becomes difficult to fully standardize one set of metrics that's going to satisfy them all. So if there's any other comments on that, but that's sort of my comment about a user lens, and maybe in a few minutes I'll also ask a question about a different question about use. And just the comment also about what I find I always come back to in the fundamental question about true cost accounting is the cost to whom? Who are the cost bearers? Who are the receivers of benefits? We often take the point of view of its cost to society, but it's really only government and society as a whole that cares about the costs of society. We're assuming that the financiers, we're assuming that the insurers, we're assuming that even the individual actors in the food system care about the costs of society as a whole, which, you know, the environmental problems that we find ourselves in, you know, demonstrate that that's not, you know, that's a difficult assumption to make, or a difficult assumption to work on. So yeah, that's my comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. And I'll hand it over to Francisca, and then give the opportunity for Carl and Lauren and everyone else to respond as well.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So first of all, I want to congratulate Lauren and everybody for the book. Thank you for the invitation to be panelist here. And thank you, Carl. Congratulations for the chapter. I read it and read it again because I'm not an expert in this topic. And then I thought about a question that comes from my background of work. So I'm going to read it out. Okay. So coming from a biodiversity institution in Mexico, and from a country which has provided many valuable crops to the world, maize, chiles, beans, squashes, and so on, genetic diversity is mainly provided by crop wild relatives and crops that are still traditionally managed, as we have shown for the case of maize in the past. So traditional agriculture is fundamental for genetic diversity continuing to evolve through time. So the future of agriculture as a whole depends on this genetic diversity. That is the contained in the crop wild relatives and the crops that are cultivated in a traditional way. The chapter, your chapter, introduces itself by quoting the paper of Pavan Sukhdev in 2016 related to the current emphasis on yields, rather than the public goods provided by small-scale agriculture as a whole. So in your opinion, or from your point of view, what is the ultimate road to visibilize and strengthen the role of small-scale agriculture through TCA, through true cost accounting? What needs to happen? Thank you.
So I'll jump in here, Matthew. I'm actually going to try and link your question, Francesca, with some thoughts which are developing in response to Stephen. I think my sense is that one of the risks in the true cost accounting space is that we see the measurement as being sort of the end goal, or the choice of metrics being the end goal, or potentially down to some sort of triple bottom line. And I think there's a real risk in that space. So because you do run into the types of challenges that Stephen said, that how do we choose the right metrics? How do we get these sort of standards and those types of things together? And so in my mind, at least, the huge benefit of true cost accounting and other sort of phrases, natural capital accounting or multiple capitals, those sorts of things, is actually about the way you start thinking about the world. It's not really so much about the measurement. It partly is, but this common language and your way in which you frame the need to think about a broader range of issues, this systemic thinking. Now, and I've already said two of my answers, and I'll use it again. I think the answer to your question, Francesca, is really about taking this capitals approach, because the reason that you want to try and pick up the capitals thing is that you start to bring in questions of resilience and capacity. And so questions of, I don't think we probably know enough about it yet. We probably know it, well, we could know a lot more. We probably know enough to understand that genetic diversity is really going to be critical. So we need to then turn the conversation. So true cost accounting then can be a vehicle for taking that story forward. It's not really about the fact that the risk is that we have one discussion on genetic diversity over here, and then we have a different discussion on some metrics around true cost, and we're not quite sure how to measure genetic diversity, so we leave it out. And that would be very unfortunate. So I think the idea is that true cost accounting becomes a vehicle, a process for taking forward these things, because it does come from this capitals lens type thing. And then hopefully that's how I would frame things. The final observation would be to respond to Stephen's comment about the costs. I think it's certainly true that that a lot of public goods are not seen as costs by people. But not too long ago, I heard a great sort of expression from someone that today's public costs are tomorrow's private costs. So essentially, it's really, we're talking a little bit of an intergenerational, and probably not that long as a generation, that the real story about true cost accounting is not really about whether or not you see the costs now, but unless you deal with some of those longer term costs, then the costs of inaction become private costs. And that's what we're starting to see with climate change. We probably haven't quite see that yet with biodiversity loss, but that is the risk we take. So it's how do we then, and to use the sort of common term, how do we internalize these longer term costs and because they will happen. Eventually they will turn from public costs into private costs.
Thanks. Did you want to jump in, Lauren? I wasn't sure if that was an old hand or new hand.
It was a new hand, Matthew, and I'd like to just bring in the idea of value into the conversation, because we're talking a lot about costs, but we can also talk about this work as true value assessment or accounting. And I think this is really important in relationship to your question, Francisco. So how do we use this process and this kind of assessment to really hold up what we value in food systems and begin to value that differently? And this is a really important aspect of the true cost accounting work that we're doing. Right now, we're in the midst of doing true cost assessments of 10 beacons of hope, initiatives that are engaged in food systems transformation around the world, whether they reach private sector, government, et cetera. And really what we're looking at is, what is their value? What value are they providing? What are the benefits of their activities. How do they see that in their worlds? So I think this is a really important part of the conversation in true cost accounting.
Thanks. And Agnes, thank you for patiently waiting.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everyone. Hello to everyone. First, congratulations for this big book. I think it's a big piece, which will be very helpful in. I'm sorry, I have some echo in my phone, so I don't know how to manage that. Well, I do my best. So I think one of the merits of this book really is to show the importance of the system approach, something which is not necessarily very understood by the private sector. And I think we clearly have to foster the understanding of such approach. And the result of this is not only to be able to mitigate the risk, and as I said, a cost of inaction becomes a private cost. I think it's a very interesting sentence. But I also wanted to highlight the fact that by our activities, sometimes we can also create value. And I would like to thank Lauren for mentioning that. It's not only about cost, but if you are doing well, and we have an example today about what we can do, we are really creating value. So that's important to remind. My second remark is about the importance to create a common language. You're absolutely right that we are facing some like a tension between being very relevant at local level and also being obliged to apply some specific KPIs, but at the same time, be able to compile all of these in a coherent manner to elevate the view at the corporate level, as an example for a company. So we need to find, I think, the right level between being too high level or too specific in order to be able to have the same language also across different sectors and different stakeholders, whether it's the private sector, the governments, the investor, etc. And the last point I wanted to highlight is about the operationality. For companies, it's very important that we are able to define some KPIs that are quite easy to implement, and that not too costly. And I think it's specifically important for small companies, because we can imagine that big companies get some expertise and the capacity to get a lot of data and acquire some primary data coming from an own activity, but for SMEs, it will never be the case. So we have to be also pedagogic, simple, accessible for these smaller organizations. So there is clearly a need to streamline the KPIs that will be follow up and to really focus on what matters. It might be different from one sector to another, but I think it's important that we all agree that what matters is a short list of KPIs that everybody will be able to follow, monitor, and to report. And finally, I wanted to stress the crucial need to reach out the investors, because we know that they start to understand that it matters, but I'm not sure they really have a very good understanding of what's behind. So there is big work to do on that side. Thank you.
Thanks, Agnes. Would Carl or Lauren like to comment on that?
Yeah, say that really good points. I mean, I can't disagree with them. I think it highlights one of the thoughts that came to mind as you were talking there, Agnes, was the role of accounting. And this is something that my background in actual fact is working on the national accounts and measuring GDP. And so I've thought for a long time, over the last 10 years or so, as I've been working in this space, about why it is that GDP has been relatively successful, and what the role of, in that sense, how does this work? Because accounting can be seen as the sort of the dark side in many respects. So I think there's two things in my mind. One is that using accounting as a part of the word in terms of true cost accounting, actually gives an entry point for bringing these sort of a broader range of environmental, social issues into a group of people who are not really trained to think about them as well as they might. So into that economics and finance space. And that was certainly the motivation for the work that I started on 10 years ago in bringing environmental data into the national accounts. And so that way of using accounting as a way of getting in the door and having a conversation and being part of a broader discussion, I think is quite important. The other thing which is I find really surprising, or I have found really surprising, is the power of accounting in terms of stocks and flows as a descriptive tool for systems. And I think that's often underappreciated. It's often it's not. It is surprisingly effective because there are many other ways in which you can describe systems that exist in the literature. But it turns out that accounting is actually quite a compatible one in that respect. So it does give this space for sort of moving forward. And I'm just building off the comments you have. I'm not trying to respond to the questions. In terms of, but one comment on the cost of implementation, I think what we're starting to see is a much stronger connection between the holders of data and those who are looking to do these sorts of analysis. So my background is really from the official statistics space, and we're starting to see much more joint operation, I guess, between statisticians who've traditionally focused on economic and perhaps more population and employment data, getting into trying to bring sort of environmental data and more social data, more granular level data down at community scales, use of GIS and satellite type of imagery, that sort of thing. And I think to the extent that there are more public data sets that are available, perhaps sourced, focused on these key indicators, as you suggested, key metrics, then the potential to be able to have data for SMEs, for local communities, and those types of things, it will become a much more. Hopefully, we can build on that and sort of bring that together and lock that in.
Thanks, and I might just bring in a few of the audience questions here. They link to the last section of the chapter, which is called Scaling Up TCA Adoption by Policymakers. And here we're talking not only about policymakers, but the wider scaling of it by investors and businesses of different sizes. So one of the questions was by Francis Warren, and it asks, what applications might there be of this TCA framework for modeling or foresighting of future scenarios at the national global level? And the question by Bill Grayson, I'll read them both because they might link to each other, and they also might not, depending on how you interpret it. Do the UN's Sustainable Development Goals provide the best framework for structuring TCA metrics, and should they? Lauren?
I'll just jump in to the last, the sort of to tie up the last part of the conversation, and then before getting into these questions. A few additional thoughts came to mind after hearing what Carl said. First of all, how do we nest this work on true cost accounting for food systems within broader efforts on value accounting? So there are a number of efforts underway related to value accounting. So all of these things need to be nested in terms of interoperability, like Agnes was saying. And also, I guess the higher level thing that came to mind is how do we support businesses and investors to take up true cost accounting? What does that look like from a governance perspective? And I've been thinking in recent weeks about what would it look like to have normative principles for true cost accounting in food systems? What would those be? And how do we create a standard that provides legitimate purpose for business to take up these assessments? And then we avoid issues around kind of antitrust, anti-competition, for example, and businesses can, work collectively to begin to think about the broader externalities and the broader value as well, their broader value as well. So I just wanted to add that into the conversation. And of course, Carl, in the chapter, you do highlight the need for, this index and the kind of broader normative principles that would inform different sectors, policymakers, and businesses, investors, potentially in different sets of principles. for how to undertake a true cost accounting assessment. I think the question about foresight and using true cost accounting for design is really interesting. And actually, Stephen, yeah, your hand is up. Maybe you could speak to this, because I think the Economics Commission is doing some work, at least to understand the externalities of the Food Systems Economics Commission, to understand the externalities of subsidies. So theoretically, that's going to shape the design of guidance for new agricultural subsidies. And I think there are many applications for using true cost accounting as a foresight tool, as a design tool, to help consider different scenarios and understand trade-offs in decision making.
Yeah, feel free to hop in there, Stephen or Carl.
I just have a comment about, or it can partly answer or make a comment about Francis's question. Then I'd like to make a comment about Bill and the SDGs. I liked Carl's comment there that the public costs now are the private costs of tomorrow. I think that's a very, valuable way to bring the people that are concerned about private costs, like the politicians, etc., into the value of this. It's one thing about GDP, it cops a lot of flack as being a measure of value, as it should in some respects. But it's interesting that one thing it doesn't do, it doesn't look at GDP into the future. It does not look at, the economic activity now, what it does into the future. Of course, not all the costs are in the future. The biggest one, of course, is climate change. But if we look at one of the other big costs, the cost of nitrogen, which are nitrogen pollution, nitrogen emissions, which the food system is, almost primarily responsible for globally. They're not so much into the future. It takes about a decade for nitrogen to leach through the soil and into groundwater, but that's one of the smallest costs of nitrogen. Their costs being incurred now from, or relatively soon, from the emissions that occur. So they're unseen. So it's perhaps it's someone else's cost that we don't see, whether that someone is in the future or that someone is hidden from our economic view. It's someone else's cost. But to go back to value, I thought that's one of the things that TCA can give. It gives a vision of value. It can help us see the economic system, the economy that we're missing out on. We talk about costs, we talk about losses, we talk about impacts. But when we see that, the GDP in the future could actually be greater than it is on our current track, and the value that GDP has, or that it represents in terms of development across the world, it helps us see what we're missing out on, not just what we're sort of incurring damage-wise. So I think that's one of its great values as well, the economy that we could have by reducing these impacts. To go quickly to the SDGs, I think they're an excellent basis for cost for society, and to linking to capital accounting. There's lots of aspects of links between the capitals and the SDGs. However, for the valuation part of the accounting sort of has an inventory part and a valuation part. When we get down to the nitty-gritty of working out social costs, like the social cost of carbon, most people know that things like the social cost of nitrogen, when we start looking at marginal abatement costs for some of these things in the food system, which from economic theory are the costs of society, should be the difference between what we're doing now and the economically optimal thing to do. For those, we need targets from the quantities associated to impact, the amount of nitrogen emissions, the amount of our dietary intake that is causing us harm, the amount of carbon emissions. So that's where you then look naturally more not at the SDGs, but at things like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, because they give us targets on those quantities, very specific. So to bring the SDGs into that valuation side, there needs to be a bit more interface between the SDGs and targets for the quantities of impact to do the valuation. That's my comment about the SDGs. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. And would Carl like to respond to anything said previously or either of those questions?
Yeah, maybe just to support the observations that there certainly should be a close link between accounting and the forecasting side of things. Indeed, I think if you think about accounting as an information set that can then be used in all sorts of a lot of different applications, then forecasting will be one of them. And the notion of stocks and flows, the idea that assets have a value that is based on what will happen into the future, sort of naturally leads you into a forward-looking sense within an accounting framing. So that should be that's clear for me. I think on the SDGs, I'd really like to support the SDGs. So I come from the same place from as Stephen has indicated and Lauren, that I've been involved in sustainability measurement for over 20 years. And when the SDGs first came out, I thought, oh, well, here we go again, another set of indicators. And around the world, there's hundreds, almost probably thousands of sustainability indicator sort of framings. I've been amazed at how the SDGs have been done. It's partly the communications and the great coloured boxes, and there's nothing magical about having 17. But at the same time, in this spirit of a common language, it's really important that we try and get behind it. Because if we spend all our time arguing about whether or not there are 17, 15, 10, and all those sorts of things, we'll lose the potential in the momentum. But that idea that we need to make this connection to other things, such as science-based targets, I think is a really important one. But that again goes back to this question of process. How can we get behind one thing? And the SDGs are a wonderful framing for the types of things that we think we might like to achieve as a global community. How do we get behind that and then worry about the detail and keep that moving along as we need to?
Thanks, Carl. And we're nearing the end of our time of our formal session, but we'll keep the room open for an additional 50 minutes for a more open conversation. Maybe we'll move into kind of concluding remarks, or I could pass it over to Lauren first. What would you like people to take away, if you could limit the amount of takeaways from either this chapter specifically or this book in general?
Thanks. This has been such a great conversation, and I hope we can continue it. It makes me think of sort of the future directions for TCA for food systems. I just wanted to return to the idea of, the importance of normative principles and standards or guidance. I really liked, Agnes, your mention of sort of the pedagogical elements of true cost accounting. How do we work on those? And how do we ensure we uphold, this kind of participatory process, the dialogue as a central part of that process. There does need to be alignment. Stephen, I really liked your comment, your beautiful comments, in particular around the economy we're missing out on. So how do we just continuously seek alignment, yes, with the SDGs, with the broader field of value accounting, with an impact assessment? How do we grow the community? There is a lot of activity, of course, in this kind of broader community in this space, but it does require maturity and alignment. So how do we create processes for that? And then finally, just the importance of upholding systems approaches. Ultimately, this is about just trying to understand the complex systems that we are part of, the interdependencies between different systems, really upholding the importance of an integrated whole. And through that, thinking about the lock-ins, where are we stuck? And how do we, if we have these knots, how do we, what threads do we need to cut to kind of release the knots? So thank you again for the conversation. Really interesting.
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, so maybe 3 final points from me. One is just to reinforce, which I started a number of my answers with, about the focus on capitals. I think that's, for me, the concern about GDP is not really about whether or not GDP is a good measure, but GDP doesn't take into account any capital costs. We need to understand the costs and bring in a notion of investment into these capitals that we are investing in our environment, in our society, in our people, and trying to bring that mindset through. And I think a lot of things then start to flow from that. The second one is that this is possible. I think this book as a whole demonstrates that while doing the whole part of what's potentially within scope of true cost accounting is beyond the scope of any individual exercise, there are so many people who know so many parts of the puzzle. And this book brings together all of the different parts that are possible and demonstrates that things can be done, and can be done sensibly, and can be done increasingly more smart. That's probably not the right word I'm looking for, but anyway, and we just need to be careful of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. We'll be arguing about these technical aspects for hopefully for decades. We need to be careful about letting those technical conversations limit the opportunity to actually tell the core message. And finally, so as I've said, I've been in this space for around 10 years, in the more 20 years on sustainability, but more directly in this sort of accounting for sustainability in the last 10. The dynamic has changed in the last 6 to 9 months. It's really quite phenomenal how much it has changed in terms of the way in which people are talking about capitals, whether it's the environment, and from all sorts of sectors. The traction in these sorts of ideas is incredible, but no one really knows where to start. And that's really the opportunities there are growing very rapidly. And so I just encourage anyone who's involved in these sorts of conversations to feel confident that there's no perfect language that you need to use, but having the conversations and trying to reach out, and you will have support. There's people out there who are happy to support. Take the book, find some nice examples in there for yourself, and see what you can do.
Thank you, Carl. Yes, thank you to all the panelists. We have a truly global panel here. Thank you to Lauren, and thank you to Carl also pointing out that he's currently in Melbourne, Australia, where it's after midnight. So we really appreciate you making the effort. And just as you can see, my colleague Helen wrote in the chat, there's a few other ways that you can stay tuned and engage with our work at Table, where we host different events like this, including a podcast with a link to the episode where I spoke with Lauren about connecting local and global scale to place, and you can subscribe to our newsletter Fodder. So that concludes our event.